Me, I want what's coming to me.
Oh, well, what's coming to you, Tony?
The world, Chico.
You see this watch?
Okay, hi guys, and welcome to the show. Today we're going to be doing another top 10 movies for watch lovers. Now this is part 2. I've already done a part 1. I'll leave a link in the description if you missed it. I always have great fun doing these. I really enjoy cinema and of course watches. Now today's wristwatch check is somewhat inspired, well, totally inspired by the movies, and I actually talked about this watch in part 1. This of course is the Giugiaro designed, the ultra 80s reissue of the watch featured in Aliens. And like part 1, I've selected 10 films. The great thing is there's just so many films to talk about, and I've already started preparing notes and researching for part 3. So let's start with Die Hard, of course, the 1988 action film directed by John McTiernan, which actually he kind of relates to part 1 as well because he directed Predator, which we covered in the previous video. So starring Bruce Willis, of course, and the late great Alan Rickman is probably one of the most memorable villains of all time. Now this is a great film for watch lovers as it features the Rolex DateJust as a plot device, because this is set in the 80s. Obviously we're in that kind of Patrick Bateman era, loads of money generation. For my American audience, that was a Harry Enfield reference. Look it up, loads of money. The film is also rather bizarrely a Christmas film. It's a very enjoyable because it's set at Christmas. Alan Rickman is well, he pretends to be a terrorist, but actually it's a heist movie. So Bruce Willis is an NYPD cop that is just in the wrong place at the wrong time in this LA. It's set entirely in this high-rise. Anyway, I'm sure you've all seen it. It's a very fun, typically 80s action film. Some of the most memorable lines ever.
Do you really think you have a chance against us, Mr. Cowboy?
Yippee-ki-yay, mother.
It features a Rolex DateJust, and what is fantastic, right at the end there's a confrontation where Alan Rickman's character, Hans Gruber, is hanging, literally holding onto this watch, which is on the wrist of Bruce Willis's wife. I forget her name, the actress's name. Guys, do correct me in the comments. Anyway, so he flicks the clasp, and because he's hanging on to her by the watch, the little fold over, those terrible stamped clasps, he falls to his death. Very, very cool, and yeah, just a fun. It's funny, when I was young I kind of dismissed these action films as kind of trashy blockbusters, but compared to the offerings these days, I've got to say it's a masterpiece of 80s cinema. It really is. So what do we got next now? Interstellar. Now I have actually reviewed the Hamilton Khaki, is it a Hamilton Khaki Pilot watch? That was it. It's one of 2 watches featured in this movie. Now this is a 2014 release. It's a sci-fi epic. It's a British American film directed of course by Christopher Nolan, starring Matthew McConaughey and I think it's Anne Hathaway. Yeah, Anne Hathaway. I love this film. It is a bit of a divisive one. Time features heavily as part of the plot because it's set in a dystopian future where essentially a crop plane pilot travels through a wormhole to find, because the Earth is dying or coming to an end, to find a new home for mankind. In my opinion, it's Nolan's best work so far. It's not a perfect film by any means, but Very enjoyable, beautifully shot, incredible special effects. It's quite emotional in some parts. I've got to say, beautifully made, really beautifully made. Anyway, so Hamilton actually designed one of the watches, because there's two watches featured in this film. There's the watch that the character Cooper, played by Matthew McConaughey, wears, which is the Khaki Pro Pilot. I have reviewed this watch. Incredible watch, beautifully designed and quite affordable in the whole scheme of things. It's a true icon. Hamilton have been in over 400 movies. Quite astounding. Yeah, I only recently kind of found out about this, and they will actually feature also in part 3 of this series of videos. But what makes this unique in this film is that Hamilton actually designed a watch just for the movie, and it's a real shame that the Murph watch is not available for commercial release, because it's just gorgeous. It's a kind of pilot watch slash field watch. There's elements of both, but it is classic Hamilton. It just has a lot of design traits that are, you know, just very synonymous with the brand. And in fact, actually, there was a petition in the UGWC to get Hamilton to release it. I don't think they ever will. There are some releases from Hamilton that are similar. I forget the references, but yeah, it's, God, if that watch was released, I would buy it in a heartbeat. Beautiful cathedral hands, very classic, very kind of American in that Hamilton, typical Hamilton way. Anyway, wonderful movie. Have a look back at the review. I'll also add a link in the description. Let's move on to our third movie. It is Glengarry Glen Ross. Now, this is a really remarkable film with an incredible cast. Just looking at the front here, we've got Al Pacino, Jack Lemmon, Alec Baldwin, Ed Harris, Alan Arkin, and Kevin Spacey. Directed by James Foley and written by David Mamet. As actually, he wrote it as a play first. This is a wonderful adaptation. I think it has some of the most memorable lines.
Put that coffee down.
There's a lot of profanity, but it is, I mean, just the acting, it's not a particularly long film. The story is about these salesmen, a group of salesmen. They're not doing too well. Alec Baldwin is this kind of hotshot sent in by the bosses, their superiors, to motivate them. He gives one of the most incredible speeches ever committed to celluloid.
Always be closing.
And the watch plays an integral role in this.
You see this watch? You see this watch?
Yeah.
That watch costs more than your car. I made $970,000 last year. How much you make?
He delivers this profanity-laden, just a torrent of abuse that is just encapsulates that whole age of that. It's kind of, yeah, it's early 90s, but still very much an overspill of the Reagan era. And I do actually find this film quite claustrophobic and rather depressing. But anyway, the watch, he says, Alec Baldwin delivers the line, you see this watch, it's worth more than your car. And it is very brash and very vulgar. And the watch is, of course, the typical captain of industry, the Rolex Day-Date on the president. Actually, it's not on the president bracelet. And then there is a little bit of debate about this online. Some people say it's a gold DateJust. I'm betting my money it's a Day-Date, although it's tricky to see. In the DVD, the image is not that crisp, but regardless, it's a Rolex, whatever it is, the ultimate aspirational, kind of symbolic of that age. So yeah, that is number 3. Okay, what have we got next? Well, actually, I just watched this last night. Back to the Future. Came out in 1985. Tremendous fun rewatching it last night. I hadn't watched it since childhood. This is more of a action, adventure, comedy, sci-fi, right? Directed by Robert Zemeckis, starring Michael J. Fox, who's very charming and lovable in this. But I think Christopher Lloyd as the Doc, as the eccentric scientist, mad scientist, he really steals the show. I mean, with his bulging eyes. I've Loved him ever since, I think it was One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. There's also the DeLorean designed by Giugiaro as well. Again, kind of linking back to my wristwatch check. Very, very 80s. The costumes, the sets, the music, it's just spot on. And funnily enough, the doc, Christopher Lloyd, pulls a Schwarzkopf, typical in his kind of eccentricity and exuberance. Very, very fun. A watch that really steals the show, and as you can see on the cover, Michael J. Fox is actually checking the time, because obviously Back to the Future, it's do I even have to do the synopsis of the film? I mean, who hasn't seen this film? Funnily enough, I actually have the watch here today. This is the Casio CA53W. Sorry about the focus. What is remarkable, Casio still make this watch to this day. Emblematic of the 80s to a T. I mean, the strap, these rubber little buttons here, the square nature of it, the nerdiness. It's a calculator, of course. You can still get them on Amazon, on eBay for next to nothing. Very, very fun. I adore them. So yeah, we have just... it's so funny. When I was at school, growing up in the 90s in London, this was the hottest commodity. I mean, people were swapping Micro Machines, their entire Micro Machines collection, just to get one of these. I had the F91W, but the rich kids had these. So there we go. There we go. And guys, if you know what the doc wears in his Schwarzkopf, please do share down below. I caught a glimpse of it. I think it's one of them is on a mesh bracelet, and possibly a Seiko. Anyway, let's move on to the next film. We couldn't get a more different film. This is Michelangelo Antonioni's absolute masterpiece, Blow Up. This is from 1966, set in the swinging 60s of London. Very, very cool film. I actually saw this for the first time in art school. They made us watch it because I was studying photography at the time. This is before I went into music. Stars David Hemmings and Vanessa Redgrave, that's it. And she's quite important because of the watch choice. We'll get onto that in just a moment. I adore this movie. I got to admit, when I first saw it in art school, I didn't understand it. It is an art film, and it deals with very... there's a lot of layers to this film. It deals with the transition between modernism and postmodernism in cinema. It deals with the protagonist, David Hemmings. He's a photographer. Him questioning the purpose of art and the purpose of his own creative endeavors in photography. And underneath all of this is this thriller element where he inadvertently captures a murder while photographing a couple in the park. Now, I adore Antonioni. He's very, very important to me. He's a director that... first of all, he directed The Passenger with Jack Nicholson, that I do really recommend you watch. Unfortunately, I'm not sure if that has any good wristwatches in it, but is one of my definitely top 5 favourite films of all time. Blow Up is... It's still a masterpiece. It's a little bit more intellectually challenging, shall we say. But what is fascinating about this film is the watch that Vanessa Redgrave wears. It's fascinating for 2 reasons. Firstly, she wears it over the cuff. Now, I know it became a bit of a style thing, but this was 1966, way ahead of its time. I mean, not only is the film way ahead of its time. Oh, and before I forget, there's Jeff Beck is in the film. There's a scene with the Yardbirds playing guitars. It's really, really cool. So there's Jeff Beck and who else? Another famous musician. Oh, and the name escapes me. Guys, fill me in the comments. Anyway, back to the watches. Right, so she wears it over the cuff, which is very, very ahead of its time. Secondly, it's a Rolex Submariner. We're talking about a 40mm dive watch. I'm pretty sure this is the reference 5513 as well, because it makes sense, because it was... And we're joined by the NYPD, or the ambulance service. Hello guys. New York, what can I do? Anyway, I will soldier on. So, It's the Sub 5513, and I could tell because it's got the domed acrylic crystal. It doesn't have a date. There's no Cyclops there. She was one of the first female actresses to wear a man's watch in film, in cinema. Before, it had only been, women's watches. If you look at watch trends of the last decade, there has been the boyfriend watch trend. We've seen actresses wearing Daytonas, like Cameron Diaz, I can't speak, wearing a Rolex Daytona, and I really love that. My wife borrows my watches all the time. It's become very kind of trendy and acceptable, especially here in New York. I think that's really cool, but she was doing this in 1966. Very indicative of ultra-progressive London, which was just the epicenter of a lot of things going on, culturally, music, cinema, art, you name it. So very, very cool. Right, so that was blah. Let's move on to the next one. Steve McQueen, the king of cool. Now, this is a DVD I bought off eBay. I haven't actually even opened it. This is a double bill with Bullitt and Papillon. Papillon doesn't have any watches in it. It's set in, I think, in the 18th century. But anyway, I bought it for Bullitt. Bullitt is... where do we start with Bullitt? It's such a cool film. Came out in 1968, so late 60s, directed by Peter Yates, starring Steve McQueen, of course, as Frank Bullitt. He's this detective in San Francisco, fighting organized crime. First of all, it's got one of the coolest car chases ever captured in film. The duel between McQueen and his, I think it's a Ford Mustang GT, it's a 68 Mustang GT versus a Dodge, pretty sure it's a Dodge Charger. Not only that, it's got a lot of the traits that have become synonymous with McQueen's coolness, the turtleneck sweaters, the tweed jacket, the shoulder holster for his gun. Now, Steve McQueen is incredibly iconic for wearing, his Rolex Sub, the Hua Monaco, my personal favorite, the Hanhart 417, which is a beautiful World War II chronograph. But in this, he wears the Benrus field watch. Now, there is a lot of speculation as to what precise model this is. Judging by the dial, judging by the year of the release, my money's on the reference 3061, and they are a Belgium-American watch company. They have their components made in the Champ de France, Switzerland. During this time, they were hired by the American Army to make field watches that were issued, and this was to military specifications. They became so successful that they later released a version for the civilian market. There's some really great shots of it where he's wrestling the steering wheel of the car in the car chase. Absolutely fantastic. It was a manual wind based on the ETA 2372 with hacking. And what is really quite astounding about this, again, just shows you why McQueen was such a style leader, really, a trendsetter, is that he was wearing these military watches before it became fashionable. These days, it's just a very normal thing for people to, outside of the military to wear them. He was a watch guy, there's no denying it. So, very, very cool indeed. I totally recommend it. And actually, I'm quite happy I got Papillon as well. Dustin Hoffman's in it. Really cool film as well. I haven't watched these two for a while. I think that's my tonight's movie sorted. Anyway, moving on. What have we got next? The Deer Hunter. Now this is a personal favourite of mine. Well, they're all personal favourites. 5 Academy Awards, it says on the cover. Incredible, including Best Picture. So, The Deer Hunter, epic war drama, directed by Michael Cimino, who, funnily enough, I wasn't aware of this. I just learnt that he co-wrote Silent Running, which is pretty cool. I love that movie as well. I don't think that's got any watches in it. Be cool if it did. Anyway, we'll get to that. So, starring Robert De Niro, Christopher Walken. This film is it's a tough film to watch. Beautifully, beautifully shot. The juxtaposition between the wide, they're almost like paintings, these shots of the wilderness, the American wilderness, the mountains of when they're deer hunting, and then contrasted by the very close, gritty, dark scenes of during the Vietnam War. It's about three childhood friends from a small town, a little Russian American community. They go off to after getting married, and the first act is about setting their town, and the second act is them in Vietnam in captivity, being forced to play Russian roulette, one of the most horrific, gut-wrenching, utterly mortifying scenes ever. I mean, really hard to watch, and De Niro and Walken are just incredible. I mean, really phenomenal. It's tough to describe. If you haven't seen it, I urge you to see it. What is interesting about this scene, and this scene in particular, is that there's a panning shot across the table, and the watches are used as currency in the bartering system of who's going to win, or, well, who lives in the Russian roulette game. During this panning shot, you can see that it's a bit like, you know, there's currency being plonked down and a whole plethora of amazing watches. There's Seikos, there's Rolex GMTs, there's Submariner, and in fact, Robert De Niro wears a Submariner himself. Very, very cool the way that watches are used. It should be talked about, should be mentioned in here. It's a very subtle, it's a flash, you know, the watches don't play a big role, but they do play a role in that scene. So very, very cool, and just one of the most, God, there's so many levels to this film. It is astounding. I really urge. Oh, and I just forgot, Meryl Streep is in it as well. She's incredible. She really is incredible. Very beautiful when she was young. Very beautiful. Anyway, guys, watch it if you haven't seen it. Absolute masterpiece of cinema. Yeah, let's move on. Right, now we have North by Northwest, my personal favorite film, directed by Alfred Hitchcock. This is from 1959, starring Cary Grant and starring James Mason as the villain. So the basic premise of this movie is a Madison Avenue, a little bit like Mad Men, NYC advertising man, very kind of dashing, very well dressed in his incredible grey suit that he wears in this movie. He gets mistaken by James Mason, the villain, as a spy, and thus gets caught up in this espionage thriller. There's some very iconic key scenes involving, well, the crop duster scene, of course, and the finale on Mount Rushmore. In the Mount Rushmore scene, you do get a shot of the watch. The watch in this movie is the Cartier Tank in yellow gold, worn on a black leather strap. I love this watch casting in this movie. Cary Grant actually wore a lot of square watches himself. Very sartorially sharp, well-dressed, dapper gentleman, and nothing is more dapper than a Cartier Tank. What I really admire about the Tank in this movie, you hardly ever see it because it's so thin, slides under the cuff. Seldomly you see the little sapphire cabochon on the crown just sticking out, just very subtly. Wonderful, and it just suits his whole outfit, his attire, incredibly well. The watch doesn't really feature that heavily, it's not a plot device, but I think it's just a wonderful example of when a watch matches a style, a whole era. I mean, people dressed, everybody's very well dressed in this film. It just makes me question our current, let's not get into that. A wonderful film. If you haven't seen it, it's a classic, really has stood the test of time. I mean, it's Hitchcock. What more can I say? What more can I say? Anyway, so that's definitely in there. Right, next, Goldfinger. I had to put Goldfinger in this, and a lot of you were like, why didn't you put any Bond movies in part one? Well, I was intending to do a video just on the Bond movie franchise, and since then we did a live show, actually it was last week, with the professional actor Duncan Casey, Double O Casey. He has had first-hand experience working on Skyfall, so it was really great to get a professional actor in to discuss, and he's a big Bond fan as well. We really went quite deep on the Sean Connery years. Now, I picked Goldfinger for a few reasons. Personally, It's one of my favorites of the franchise. It has the DB5. It has one of the most wonderful selection of suits and jackets and sports jackets. And just general sartorial choices for Sean Connery. We get the Shirley Bassey intro and theme. I love the plot. One of the greatest henchmen in the Bond movies, in my opinion. Odd Job, of course. But most importantly, we see the Rolex Submariner 6538 for the first time on that strap. Now, I so nearly said NATO strap, and it is a mistake. It's not a NATO strap. It is actually a one-piece. There is a shot where you see the nylon loop. It's also been infinitely debated on the colors. In the new Blu-ray, you can see the black is more of a navy. There's three colors, I believe. There's burgundy, there's a olive greeny gray. It's erroneously been referred to a NATO strap countless times. I've done it many times in videos as well. It's not a NATO strap. I don't think the NATO actually was a thing until a little bit later, because this of course was 1964, directed by Guy Hamilton. We also get Pussy Galore wearing the GMT Master. I believe it was Pepsi, but I picked this one because I love the way that Bond breaks so many rules. He wears it on this undersized 16mm little strap, this kind of supreme Bond-like nonchalance and coolness. He wears it with a tux, which is still a faux pas today, but back then it was definitely a faux pas. It's just, I love it. Really encapsulates his just, you know, disregard for any kind of rules or authority. Very Bond and very lovable.
You?
My name is Pussy Galore.
I must be dreaming.
I adore Goldfinger. And guys, have a look back at the live show. We're going to be doing Roger Moore next. Not quite sure when we will do that, but stay tuned. Hopefully in the coming weeks. It was very fun. So shout out to Duncan 00 Casey. Let's move on to the next. What have we got next? The last film of our selection, Scarface. This came out in 1983, directed by Brian De Palma. I'm a massive Brian De Palma fan. Interestingly, written by Oliver Stone, starring Al Pacino, of course, and the stunning Michelle Pfeiffer in her prime. Well, Al was in his prime too. The story is about Cuban refugees that come to Miami and basically wreak havoc in the drug game. This is a coke-fueled, neon-lit, out-of-control, chainsaw-wielding capitalism gone absolutely mental, you know. It's loud, it's gaudy, it's violent. But what is really interesting is the choice of watch in this movie. And this is the Omega La Magique. This is a mystery dial quartz, solid gold and he wears it on a gold bracelet. It's not mesh, it's a, how do you describe it? It's not foxtail, it's like a wheat link bracelet. Yellow gold, of course, very unlike Omega. I guess they wanted some of that cocaine money. Why not? It was the 80s after all. Very gaudy and matches the whole aesthetic wonderfully. And they have since become ultra rare. I don't think Omega made that many of them. And what is interesting is that the mystery dial, the actual rotating part is translucent, is see-through, and I've got to admit that they're not as bad on a leather strap, but I think for Tony Montana, Al Pacino's character, very well chosen. I think the wardrobe must have specifically chosen that watch. Yeah, it's there's a lot of gold in that movie, let's just say.
Say good night to the bad guy. Come on.
Now this film has been quoted and it's in countless rap songs, in other movies. It's become a bit of a cliche, and even in literature, in Roberto Saviano's hugely important milestone in journalistic literature, Gomorrah, there's a whole chapter devoted just to this movie. Some of the Camorristi bosses in Italy actually mimicked the mansion and built it brick by brick, a replica just outside Naples. So even gangsters imitate the film. Yeah, so not exactly the deepest of intellectual works, but, you know, very fun all the same. Anyway, guys, so that is my top 10 for this particular episode. I've already started work on part 3, which is going to be really, really fun, so stay tuned for that. In the meantime, please do suggest movies that you love that have great watches in them, or perhaps they were used as a plot device, or movies that us watch fans would appreciate. Please do nominate them in the comments below. I'd love to hear your feedback. Okay guys, so I'm going to leave it there. Please don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it and found it useful. Thank you very, very much for watching. And as always guys, I will catch you in the next one. Okay, ciao.
You know what it takes to sell real estate? It takes brass balls to sell real estate. Go and do likewise, gents. The money's out there. You pick it up, it's yours. You don't, I got no sympathy for it.